Hello again. This is Earl Silverman, editor-in-chief of the Journal of Rheumatology, with a special podcast, which I'd like to highlight a recent initiative of the Rheumatology Research Foundation of the American College of Rheumatology that recently funded 5 new studies examining how the SARS-CoV-2 virus affects people with rheumatic diseases and how the pandemic has altered the delivery of healthcare to patients with rheumatic diseases. To discuss this initiative, I have the pleasure of speaking to Dr. Lou Bridges, who is the foundation president. Dr. Bridges, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me.
If I may begin by saying it was great to have read about the initiative last April, and even better to have read the titles of the 5 grants that were funded to the tune of $1.65 million. So I read it. There seems to be 2 basic themes to the funded grants. One, how the pandemic has altered the delivery of care of patients. And this may be not only true for rheumatic disease patients, but patients generally. And 2, how the virus itself affects patients with rheumatic disease. Well, the first question I want to ask is, how is the foundation able to access I imagine a new $1.65 million so quickly?
Well, not all of it was new, because the $1.65 million is over the period of the lifetimes of the grants. So what we were able to do this quickly is to identify additional funds within our current year budget that will allow us to start funding the first year of these projects. And then, because we are constantly raising money for our campaigns, we felt very confident that we would be able to pick them up in the subsequent years. So it was such a priority for us that we decided that we would do this right away. And there was a group effort from a lot of people, including the Rheumatology Research Foundation executive leaders, the board of directors, in collaboration with the American College of Rheumatology. So the decision was made fairly quickly, and when we found the extra money that we needed, we pushed ahead fairly rapidly.
That's great. Now, would you like to highlight the funded grants for the listeners?
Sure. So first, before I do that, I'd like to point out that we put out a notice of special interest, and the projects that were funded were the ones that rose to the top of that. But we had several areas that we wanted to fund. So the notice of special interest that we released in April, we really wanted to make this a very broad appeal. So the foundation accepts submissions within multiple different categories: basic science, translational science, clinical science, health services research, and patient or practice-centered research as well. So the things that we said we wanted to fund were in general fairly broad, and they ended up being in the buckets as you described. But we were interested in the immune response to the virus itself and the pathogenesis of the disease in patients with rheumatic and musculoskeletal diseases, the influence of DMARDs and biologics and medications on the immune response, the studies of biologics or DMARDs used in rheumatic diseases on SARS-CoV-2 in animal models, or in vitro rather, epidemiology, clinical characteristics, outcomes of COVID-19 in patients with rheumatic and musculoskeletal diseases, the effects on access to care, including, as you mentioned, telehealth, digital tools, et cetera, and the analysis of the economic impact. So all those were put out in the sort of request for applications, notice of special interest. We were fortunate in that the timing was right, because our grants were due in July, and they're due in July every year. So by virtue of the fact of the timing of the pandemic, we were able to coincide our release of requests for applications in a way that would be supportive of doing these COVID research projects. So, we ended up with 5 really outstanding projects that went through the same rigorous review process as all the other ones. In fact, it was all part of the same review. And the ones that applied for applicability or indicated applicability to this COVID NOCI, if you will. Those that were in the funded range, we were able to supplement, provide fund these grants with the supplemental dollars that we identified. So as you mentioned, they fell into a couple of buckets. So I'll go through these very briefly, and happy to try to answer any questions if they come up. Keep in mind that these projects are underway relatively recently, and we're expecting that because they're multi-year awards that we'll start to get some results in the near future. So the first was to Kristen De Silva from Mass General, who got a Scientist Development Award. And then as another note, all of our mechanisms were open for this COVID-19. So any Scientist Development Awards, Career Development Award type projects, Independent Investigator Awards, they were all open and applicable to the NOC. And we chose the ones that scored the best in their categories. So Dr. De Silva's grant is on respiratory complications of COVID-19 and rheumatic diseases. So her aims were to investigate the short-term respiratory outcomes of COVID-19 infection in patients with rheumatic diseases compared to controls who did not have systemic autoimmune diseases. And then secondly, to look at more longer term outcomes. And now that we have the so-called long hauler syndrome, this is particularly relevant. The second project was Rebecca Haberman from NYU Grossman School of Medicine. She also got a Scientist Development Award. And her project was looking at prospectively the study the effects of immunomodulatory therapy on susceptibility to COVID in patients with inflammatory arthritis and looking at the outcomes there. So again, it was very similar looking at what happens when our patients get COVID-19. Are there factors that predispose them to getting it, and what happens when they do? What are their outcomes? Jason Knight from the University of Michigan was awarded an Innovative Research Award. And as we know, the vascular effects of COVID-19 were fairly surprising early in the course of the disease to see that there were so many vascular complications. So his study is focused on antiphospholipid antibodies in COVID-19. So as a leader in this field, he is going to examine the role of these autoantibodies in the outcomes of patients with COVID-19, and also look at the pathogenicity of some of these COVID-19 derived antiphospholipid antibodies in animal models. So,
can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
Is that both in patients with rheumatic disease and other people? Because as you were saying, most of the complications we're seeing just by sheer numbers, of course, are in otherwise healthy people.
Yeah, so this was not necessarily restricted only to patients with rheumatic diseases. So it's my understanding from reading his application that it was COVID-19 related antiphospholipid antibodies, not necessarily only in those with rheumatic disease. Does that answer the question well?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Please.
Great. And then the next one that was funded was one from Dr. Maria Danilla, who goes by Mayo, from UAB in Birmingham. And I'm very proud of this one because Mayo is one of my former trainees. So she had an Innovative Research Award granted on the effectiveness of telerheumatology for delivering high quality rheumatologic care during the crisis. And so her project aimed to actually look at objective measures of how effective telerheumatology was compared to usual care in person in some things that could be monitored, such as the standards of care that could be assessed during this time when we had a lot of patients on telehealth visits rather than in person. So she was monitoring the health outcomes, the processes of care, healthcare utilization, healthcare service utilization, et cetera. And then the final one was Dr. Swami Venturapalli. I apologize for mispronouncing his name, Swami. But he was the awardee of the Norman B. Galis Clinical Research Award. And that is a very unusual award in that it is targeted to investigators who are community practitioners. So Swami is going to do a very important project, which he called Telehealth Delivered Healthcare to Improve Care in Community Practice Rheumatology. And so the goals of this study were really to come up with best practices and really to help guide community practitioners on how best to implement telehealth rheumatology to really improve patient outcomes by providing a resource for those who are caring for these patients during this very difficult time. So we're really proud of these grants. As I mentioned, there were several different mechanisms: 2 junior people, 2 established investigators, and 1 community practitioner. So we're very proud of this, and we're very pleased that we were able to fund these awards during this very challenging time.
Well, that's great. I think I'm really looking forward to all of them. I think, and well, as we were talking before, some of the more basic science ones, I honestly hope they don't have a lot of patients.
Me too. Yeah,
society versus science. So I think society should win. But
this is one of the examples where if our investigators don't have enough material to recruit, we won't be too upset, because that means that the COVID pandemic is subsiding. Unfortunately, I think that's not going to be the case, but we will learn important insights, and we do hope that in future years we can continue to fund additional research on COVID-19 and its impact on our patients with rheumatic and musculoskeletal diseases.
That's great, and I'm really looking forward to the other 2, because I think doing good studies in telehealth is going to transform medicine. You know, I'm sure you found it, and I found that a lot of patients really like telehealth. Mm-hmm. Sitting in their own house, they don't have to, in the case of my patients, they don't have to go into downtown Toronto where parking's very expensive. They don't, no cost to sitting in their house. They don't wait around the waiting room. And I find it's much more efficient personally also. So I think if funders, both Canada, the public sector, in the US, more the private and the public sector, will fund telehealth more, I think this could revolutionize what we do. So one good thing might come of it. And that's why we need these studies to prove it.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. And, once we have these studies, I think, as you said, telehealth is here to stay. And there's always going to be a subset of our patients who this is the preferred mode that they want to be seen by. And particularly if they're doing well on stable therapies, This is a really great option.
I agree 100%. Well, thank you. And maybe a year from now, when you have some preliminary results, we'd love to talk again.
That sounds great. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay. So anything else you want to add, or not? Well,
I think I'm ready. I think I'm done.
Perfect. So for further details on this initiative, you can look at the Rheumatology Research Foundation's website, www.rheumresearch.org. And I encourage all the listeners to go to our website of the Journal of Rheumatology at www.jrheum.org to listen to our other podcasts regarding COVID-19 and rheumatic disease, and to read our special collections of articles on this topic, which are available as open access. Thank you for listening, and any questions or comments can be sent to manuscripts@jrheum.com, and keep safe and follow the recommendations of your local health authorities regarding COVID-19 precautions. And I really want to thank Dr. Bridges for taking the time to explain this very important initiative.
Thank you.